Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the weekly QueenVest Expert Interview Series, where we introduce you to preeminent professionals working in the franchise industry so that we can bring valuable perspectives and help you succeed as a franchisee. I'm Rosanna Quinnan. I am a financial coach, teacher, and an advisor, helping franchisees who are building a better future for themselves and their families. And today I'm excited to welcome Tim Elloris to our interview. Tim is the founder of Zee Advisor, a consultancy helping prospective franchisees make informed decisions about investing in a franchise. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Rosanna. It's great to be here with you.
Awesome. I was super excited for these conversations because of your background and your story. So I'm going to share a little bit of your background with our audience, and then we can dive right into the conversation. Tim worked 33 years in the oil and gas industry before taking an early retirement in 2021. And I guess retirement didn't fit him too well because after briefly searching for a small business to acquire, Tim invested in an emerging franchise brand where he ultimately lost $1 million. And not knowing the franchise landscape, he made mistakes in his franchise search. Then subsequent to closing of his franchise business, he did a deep dive to better understand the factors critical to a successful franchise search. He has developed a framework to help prospective franchisees think about how to weigh the benefits, costs, and risk associated with owning a franchise business. He recently launched Zee Advisor, an advisory firm for prospective franchisees. Tim also volunteers as a SCORE mentor. Tim, again, it's great to have you and welcome to the show. I'm excited to speak again because anywhere you look, any mall you go in, there is franchises, and you look at them as successful enterprises, and it's tempting to think that franchising is easy because the franchisor has figured everything out. They have laid out the path for you, and all you need to do is just go there and become rich. In reality, it's not as easy, is it?
Yeah, no, that's great. And first of all, thank you for the introduction. I think one thing I'll add to that, and I think this is an important takeaway for the folks that are listening, is that one of the reasons that I actually changed from looking for a small business to acquire to going into franchising is I actually perceived the risk to be lower. And at the time, I was 56, and if I was going to buy a small business, I was going to need to take out an SBA 7A loan, which was going to require me to sign a personal guarantee. And so I just perceived a certain level of risk to be associated with that. And when I started looking at franchising, I thought, okay, these are proven systems, and this is an opportunity maybe for me to take a lower risk path. And the idea being that we could self-fund our startup and get the first few locations going, and then use cash flow from those locations to then fund the remaining locations. And actually, in the end, it turned out that I took the higher risk path. And you talked about how it was an emerging brand. And yeah, I think it's just really important that people need to understand that these emerging brands, many of them are startups. Some are going to succeed, some are going to fail.
Right.
And yeah, so just think carefully about your own perceptions of risk and challenge those before you get too deep into whatever path you're going down.
Excellent. Yeah. So you have a unique story in how you came to franchising. Can you share a little more about your story and how you decided to go about franchising? You touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to hear a little more.
Yeah. Like you said, whenever I retired, I wasn't really going to retire. I just was ready to do something different. And so I started going down the path to find a small business to acquire, ended up bumping into a franchise consultant along that path. After a few conversations, the franchise consultant presented me with 4 different options. I did some due diligence around each of those brands and ultimately zeroed in on the brand in which I invested. And yeah, so that's how I discovered franchising. I didn't really set out to become a franchisee, but yeah, just along my path to find a small business to acquire. Yeah, that kind of came across that franchise broker, and that's where I landed.
I don't think many people realize how big the franchise industry is, but it's huge, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And franchising is a huge industry and it's global. I'll just focus on the US market. So just in the US, there are somewhere around 4,000 brands. And
Wow.
many people, when they think of franchising, they think of food concepts like McDonald's or Subway or similar brands. But franchising is pervasive, it's in all kinds of different categories. And yeah, 4,000 brands. There's more than 800,000 franchise establishments in the US. Those franchise establishments employ almost 9 million people, and franchising accounts for somewhere around 3% of US GDP.
Mm.
Yeah, so it's a vast
Mhm.
industry.
Yeah, so it's a great opportunity, and I'm not surprised that many people do want to explore it. But it's also figuring out what the industry looks like. Since I've started with in the franchise space, I've come across a whole industry. It's a whole network of people and players. It's not just the franchisor and the franchisee. There are suppliers, there are consultants, there are CPAs, there are all, so that's an entire industry. Can you talk a little bit about the players in the industry that you've seen and what their roles are?
Sure. So if somebody's interested in investing in a franchise, if they have a particular brand in mind, they can go directly to that franchisor and probably talk to one of their representatives and get the information that they need and ultimately make a decision about whether or not they want to invest. But the way that most people find their way into franchising is they're doing some search on the web and they fill out a form and they become a lead and they get contacted by a franchise broker. I don't know exactly how many brokers are out there. I believe it's somewhere in the range of maybe 2 or 3 thousand brokers just in the US. And these brokers tend to be like independent business people and they are affiliated with a franchise broker network. So a couple of the larger networks are for
Uh-huh.
IFPG, which is International Franchise Professionals Group. Each of those broker networks represent somewhere around 600 franchise brands. So the broker networks are the ones that have the relationships with the franchisors. So you as a
Yes.
candidate, you talk to a broker, that broker is affiliated with the broker network. The broker network has the contractual relationships with the franchisors. And yeah, so if you're talking to a broker who's affiliated with a particular network, you're going to be presented with options that are within the
Right.
relationships that broker network has
Mhm.
established with
Mhm.
franchisors. And I would go a step further and just keep in mind these brokers are human beings. So there's no broker who can possibly understand 600 different franchise brands, a subset of brands that they know and understand well enough where they feel comfortable presenting that to their candidates. So even though you go through this process of having multiple conversations with a broker, and maybe they're having you do personality assessment and everything is with the aim of trying to match you with a brand that fits your criteria. At the end of the day, you're going to get shoehorned into one of the brands that particular broker knows and understands. And so I
Mhm.
think it's just important for people to keep in mind that, yeah, there's 4,000 different brands out there, but the marketplace is not very efficient. And if you're working with a single broker, your universe of concepts is actually pretty small.
Mhm. Interesting. It seems a little bit like the Wild West, which is surprising given that we're in here at 2025. And who regulates franchises? And also in your assessment, how good of a job are they doing regulating these players and brokers?
Yeah. So from a regulatory perspective, the Federal Trade Commission has regulatory oversight at the federal level and enforcement authority. And that is primarily through something called the franchise rule. So the franchise rule is what drives the requirement for franchise disclosure documents. So these are documents that every franchisor is required to provide. There's 23 different items, and the franchise rule is somewhat prescriptive in terms of how those 23 items need to be populated. The
Uh-huh.
franchisor does have some discretion, though, but essentially, the FTC is just making sure that franchisors are complying with the franchise rule. But the
Uh-huh.
reality is, in the last couple of decades, uh,
Uh-huh.
there have been very few enforcement actions by the FTC. And I think that's really down to the fact that the FTC has a broad remit to deal with all types of consumer protection issues, and they get millions of complaints every year. But from franchisees, they only get thousands of complaints, right? And so the FTC is really redirecting their resources to where they perceive the largest problems to be. And so what that's meant is in the last couple of decades, again, only a handful of enforcement actions, and regulations are really only helpful if they're enforced. And I've seen personally situations where a franchisor has intentionally not disclosed information that they are required to disclose. But really all you can do as a franchisee, there's no right of private action, which means that if you find some lack of disclosure or misrepresentation in a franchise disclosure document, you cannot go sue the franchisor directly, right? All you can do is go complain to the FTC, or maybe if you live in one of the states that also provides some regulatory oversight of franchising, you can try to complain to them and see if they will take some action. But at the end of the day, the enforcement falls on the FTC and these handful of states that provide some regulatory oversight. And the reality is, in the last couple of decades, there just hasn't been a lot of enforcement.
Yeah, interesting. So it basically means that you're on your own. If you make a mistake, you have to yourself to blame, and there isn't a ton of recourse. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary. And one really curious thing that I discovered as I've gone back and learned all those things that I should have known before I signed the franchise agreement is that this franchise rule was created or implemented really with the aim of protecting consumers, and by consumers, prospective franchisees, right, to make sure that they had the information that they needed to make an informed decision. But over time, the franchisors have really learned how to use this to their benefit. And these FDDs, the franchise disclosure documents, they're typically 200 to 300 pages long. I think a lot of franchisees, prospective franchisees, don't read them very thoroughly. And so the franchisors, they're actually disclosing in there all the things that they may or may not do. And then in the end, if they don't perform, you could probably look in the FDD and see where it says that they told you they may not perform. And so in an essence, it's like a get out of jail free card for the franchisor. It's just super important for franchisees to read and understand the franchise disclosure document, not take everything that's in there at face value, and to validate. And very important is to hire an experienced franchise attorney who can explain the elements of the franchise disclosure document that perhaps you don't understand. And the franchise agreement, which is an attachment to the franchise disclosure document, you need a franchise attorney to help you understand that.
Yeah, I happened to speak to a franchise attorney a few days ago, and what she mentioned was that when there is that reluctance digging into the franchise disclosure document, and people will be reluctant to spend $2,500 to review the agreement before investing $500,000 of their life savings into the franchise. So it's apparent that you need to do due diligence. You need to understand what you're getting yourself into. So can you share a little bit what that due diligence should look like, and what you learned from your process of how to do it versus how not to do it based on what you went through and how it turned out in the end?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one thing I will admit is I did not do enough due diligence before I signed my franchise agreement. Having said that, there were lots of other franchisees who invested in the same brand who did a lot more due diligence and still ended up in the same place. And the brand that I invested in, a couple of months after I invested, they were acquired by a private equity backed firm, and they missed it, right? So there's no foolproof method, but fundamental to due diligence is just validation, right? And so it's a lot of hard work, but it really means talking to as many existing and former franchisees in that brand as you can. Don't rely on the curated list of franchisees that the franchisor is going to spoon feed you. All of the existing franchisees their names and their contact information is included in the franchise disclosure document, and former franchisees are listed in there as well. So the most important thing is to really start with a list of questions, start picking up the phone and dialing, talking to these existing and former franchisees. And as you go along, you're going to pick up nuggets from each of those conversations that might steer you to adjust your line of questioning as you talk to more and more existing and former franchisees. But you want to make sure that you're talking to a good cross section, right? So you want to talk to franchisees that have maybe just recently joined the brand in the last 1 to 2 years. You want to talk to franchisees that have been in the brand maybe as long as the brand's been around, and a lot of folks in between. You want to talk to successful franchisees and to struggling franchisees. You want to talk to franchisees in different regions of the country and in markets that look like the one that you're thinking about investing in. So I think that is really one of the most important foundations around good due diligence. It's talking to lots of existing and former franchisees. You need to probably talk to 10, 15, 20 of these folks really to get a good view on the brand.
Yeah, and it seems a lot of work, but it's worth it, right? Because it seems to be that a lot of times the franchisors will require certain capital that you need to put in. And there are cases where people actually cash in their retirement savings to do that. So it's pretty important to get a return, because otherwise your life savings are gone and you don't have a business. So how do you recover from a mistake like this?
Yeah,
if you do end up making a mistake.
Yeah, it's very difficult. The franchise agreements are very one-sided in favor of the franchisor. So if something doesn't work out, it doesn't really often matter that much whether that's down to the fault of the franchisee or the franchisor. Recourse is a very difficult path. And doing your due diligence on the front end and mitigating risk as much as possible before you sign that franchise agreement is really your only protection.
Yeah. So then, based on your experience, you decided that there was this need to help people who want to buy a franchise to really understand the whole process and to help them. And you decided to launch a company to do that, which is fantastic. Love to learn more about how you help prospective franchisees in this whole process.
Yeah, so it was a long and winding road to get to this point. After my franchise investment flamed out, I went back in the corporate world for about 8 months, and ultimately decided, though, what I really wanted to do is to take all of the lessons I learned from my franchise experience and help to coach other people who are making that transition from the corporate world like I did, or maybe they're a government employee looking to pivot into franchising, or somebody coming out of the military. So what I'm trying to do is, work with those folks and, just coach them through the process, help them understand the landscape of the industry, how the marketplace works, the broker network, how to develop some criteria so that they make sure that they're getting matched up with a brand that's a good fit for them, how to do the due diligence on that brand, and just making sure that they're going out and hiring a franchise attorney. Whether you can change the terms of a franchise agreement or not, it's just really important to hire a franchise attorney because you need to understand what it is you're signing. And then I think the other important piece is really the number one reason that businesses fail is they run out of cash, right? And so it's just really important for prospective franchisees to develop a good pro forma, right? So that they're looking at their financial projections, taking into account all of their capital expenditures and ongoing expenses, and looking at different scenarios. Because if the business doesn't ramp up as what they expected, do they have enough working capital to get to break even and then ultimately to a place where they're bringing in enough income to support the lifestyle that they desire? So
definitely. Yeah. And so what is your process? What does working with a Zee Advisor typically look like?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just to be clear, I'm not a franchise broker, right? What I do though is I work with individuals on a fee basis. So we'll start working together, and I've got some tools that I've developed that help them to work through the different steps of the search process and due diligence and so forth. But typically these are 4 to 6 month long engagements. because that's really about how much time you need if you're going to do a quality search and do all the
Okay.
proper due diligence steps before signing a franchise agreement.
Uh-huh. That's excellent. Yeah, so this is extremely valuable work. And what are some of your sort of final thoughts and takeaways for our audience?
Yeah. So I think one thing is that business ownership is messy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people that are getting into franchising are first time business owners. And again, they've worked in corporate world or for the government for many years in some instances. And so I think you have to start with a really honest self-evaluation before you get too deep into researching a franchise brand. If you're going to be a franchisee, you have to be willing to follow a system, right? And so if you're not
Right.
willing to follow a system, then go start something or buy an existing business where you can control your own destiny, because franchising is all about following a system. You need to assess your own risk tolerance. You mentioned in the outset that I invested in an emerging brand. And what I didn't realize at the time was that was really a startup. And if I had appreciated that at the time, I probably would have never considered an emerging brand. And let me just elaborate on that a little bit. So if you talk to a broker and you ask a broker, what's an emerging brand? That broker might tell you it's a brand that's maybe been franchising for a few months, but a brand, they might consider a brand that's been franchising for 6 months or a year to be proven. And that's not the case. And my definition of an emerging brand is a brand that's been franchising for less than 5 years and has less than 50 units open. And the reason that I use that definition is that there's a company called Fran Data that does a lot of great research in the franchising space. And one of their products is a fund report. And this is something that lenders use to assess the risk and creditworthiness of different franchise brands. Most prospective franchisees don't even know that these reports exist. But the thing that I like about the franchising for at least 5 years and having at least 50 units open is that when a brand hits that threshold, these fund reports then include a fund score. And if a brand has a fund score of 750 or greater, then that means that they sit within the top 10 to 25% of all of the brands in their category. And back to due diligence, you need many points of validation. And I think can be a very helpful point of validation if somebody's doing a franchise search. But anyway, so it's back to understanding what is your risk tolerance. Emerging brands might be the right answer for some people because more access to territory. So if somebody's you're probably going to have better success finding an available territory where you live versus a more mature brand where those territories may be sold out. So it may be the right answer for some people, but just understand your risk tolerance and understand the risk of emerging brands. I talked about the importance of developing a pro forma, and making sure that you're well enough capitalized, that you have enough working capital. Are you good at sales? A lot of these franchise brands really rely on somebody, you're selling, right? And so if you as the owner are not good at sales, then you need to have somebody on your team that is. And that could cut into your margin, particularly in the beginning. But you really need to think about that. And do you like dealing with employees? I've managed people my entire career, but you'll have good employees and you'll have challenging employees. You may have people that steal from you, and you need to be able to cope with all of those realities. And do you like dealing with customers? Are you willing to commit to getting the business up and running? And is your family supportive? And if you're not 99.9% certain of all of these things, and then franchising may not be the right path. So I think that's one takeaway.
Yeah, because you're still running a business, right? There may be a process and a system, but it's still your business. So you're the entrepreneur, you're the business owner, and the buck stops with you for your unit. So the unit economics need to work with who you are, where you are in life, and what your goals are, and what your capabilities and interests are, as you said. Yeah.
One other point I'd like to make is, I think there are a lot of franchise brands and franchise brokers these days that are promoting semi-absentee ownership. And I think people just need to be cautious about that. I see that as really more of a sales tactic with brokers and franchisors trying to widen the pool of potential buyers. Back to the point I made earlier, business ownership is messy. So if you're going to be a business owner, you need to be available. And thinking that you can keep your 40, 50, 60 hour a week corporate job and run this sole franchise is pretty risky. And so just be careful about that. And I do want to make one point, though, that I meant to make in the beginning. And this is back to franchising is a vast industry, right? There's 450,000 or more franchisees just in the US. I may make some statements like this one around be careful of semi-absentee business model. I'm sure you can go talk to a broker who can give you a list of 10 or 20 cases where somebody was very successful in going out and starting a semi-absentee franchise. So there are no universal truths. So I'm just saying, with respect to the semi-absentee models, just be careful. It's just like the emerging brands, may be good for some people, maybe not for others. You just have to be cautious.
Absolutely. Yeah. And maybe semi-absentee works if it's your fourth brand that you're investing in and you've had decades of experience running franchises, but not for your first opportunity. That's fantastic. So this has been a very educational and a lot of good lessons. If you're thinking about franchising, just think a little bit more carefully and do your due diligence. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, Tim, and all the valuable lessons you've learned. So if somebody from our audience wants to reach out to you, how do they reach out to you?
Yeah, so I'm very active on LinkedIn, so you can connect with me there, or you can go to my website, zeeadvisor.com, and just fill out the contact form, or you can email me directly at tim@zeeadvisor.com.
Yes, we'll definitely put the contact information in the description so that everybody who's considering a franchise should talk to Tim, because it will save you a lot of headache. And it will give you the confidence to invest in the right brand that will help you build your future. Thank you, Tim. And we'll see you next week on the show, where we will be speaking with Alicia Miller and her incredible work in helping franchisees through investing in private equity and the impact that private equity has on franchising as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week. Thank you.